This week we've got some new information from the Flight Simulator 2020 team, as well as a bunch of intriguing details from an interview between the game's developers and Argentine website Nacion. Hi guys and girls, I'm Obsidian Ant and welcome back to Flight Simulator 2020. Now, the interview in question actually answers a few questions that the community have been asking for a long while now, so it's well worth taking a look at. I'm going to get into that in this video, and then take a look at this week's development update. And meanwhile, you can see all the latest screenshots from this week's development update playing in the background right here. Now, regarding the interview itself, the text from the website is in Spanish, but if you do want to take a look at it yourself, you can find a link in the video description. So, let's get to it. Now, whilst Flight Simulator 2020 uses some of the flight model code from the previous games, the new version will nonetheless be far more complex. The developers cited it specifically as being 1,000 times more complex. In simple terms, this comes down to the airplanes in previous versions of the game being represented by a single data point, and this was located in the centre of the plane. Air pressure, temperature and all the other variables would affect only this single data point. The new aerodynamic calculations have 1,000 points of data on each plane, and this allows for the atmospheric variables to impact each part of the plane differently and will ultimately make for a far more complex and realistic flight experience. In addition to these improvements, the manufacturers of the various planes in the game have given Microsoft data on each plane. And this basically means that each plane, the flight model for each plane, should match the design parameters of their real-world counterparts. Now, this all sounds pretty awesome, but one concern that the interviewer raised was the level of processing power required to simulate these very detailed flight models. Now, the developers of Flight Sim were not concerned. They said that in their tests, the calculations for the entire climate system and flight models won't need more than 5% of a single processing core. Very impressive stuff then, and a mark of just how far computers have come over the previous decades. Now, some time was also spent discussing the bandwidth requirements for the game. So one of the biggest selling points for Flight Simulator 2020 is the amazing level of details which we've all seen in the various videos, and these aim to recreate a full-scale Earth. Bing Maps will be used to achieve this, which is Microsoft's version of Google Maps, and it means that Microsoft will have access to all the geometry details they need to create all areas on the planet. And whilst I'd personally be tempted to speculate that not every area in the game will be as fully detailed as their real-world counterparts, and of course I may be wrong on that, Microsoft and developers Asobo both remain adamant that areas in the game will look exactly like the real world. So naturally, with all of this data coming from the internet, there's the obvious question about bandwidth requirements. The developers replied that Flight Simulator 2020 will have 20 different levels of realism, and the game will use these to adjust the quality of the environment based upon the speed of the user's internet connection. It was also confirmed that once again, the game will have an offline mode, and that Flight Simulator 2020 will be fully capable of generating the world on the fly and in real time without an internet connection. However, obviously the quality for this would be far lower. And as for what the internet speed requirements will actually be, well, apparently 3 or 4 megabits per second will offer a good representation of the world, and Asobo meanwhile state that a 10 megabits per second connection will provide all the level of realism offered by the simulator. Additionally, data for specific areas can be downloaded in advance, and also data is cached whilst you play, meaning that when you fly over the same area more than once, the level of detail will improve as more data will be downloaded on consecutive flights. Now then, here's the biggest question that many people will actually have. With all these data requirements, which let's face it are likely to be huge, what is the business model going to be? Well, apparently the developers didn't have all the details for this, but they did state that it will be possible to buy the game with a single one-time purchase. They also said that it will be available on the Microsoft Game Pass service, and there was also very clear in saying that there won't be a subscription-only service for Flight Simulator 2020. So my take on this, similar to other people's, is that they aren't ruling out a subscription, but what they are saying is that a subscription won't be required to buy the game or to play the game. So whether or not there will be a subscription for the full package, it remains to be seen, but certainly the game will be playable without a subscription. Whether that means no subscription full stop, I guess we'll have to see. I'm less sure about that. Either way though, the question remains how Microsoft will monetize the game. The cost for running a service like this surely have to be absolutely huge, and whilst Microsoft have massive cloud-based computing infrastructure in the form of their Azure platform, it still comes with many operating costs. So whether or not they will pass some of these costs onto the end user, or whether they can make up for this by selling DLC, remains to be seen. And of course, maybe they've got some other, so far unimagined, way of monetizing the game. It's certainly going to be interesting to see how this all pans out. So then, a very interesting interview there. Again, the link for it is available in the video description. Let's move on to this week's development update then. First then, we've got a development roadmap here. We can see the stuff for the 13th of February includes the roadmap here. This is an insider preview available on the Microsoft website. We've also got a feedback snapshot, which we'll have a look at in just a moment. There's some more information on the alpha invites. Now, another batch of these is going out, and these will be sent between the 13th of February, which was yesterday as of this recording, and the 18th of February, which is Tuesday. So if you've applied for alpha access, and by the way you can do that on the Flight Simulator website, then fingers crossed for getting in. There's a new video feature coming on the 20th of February, and these are very interesting. They're usually quite lengthy, and the developers go into quite some detail on specific features. And this time it's going to be airports. Now I'm very curious and very interested to see how this is actually going to work, because apparently Flight Simulator 2020 is going to feature 45,000 airports from around the world. So just how detailed all of these are going to be is going to be a revelation, to say the least. And whilst on the subject of these video features, the next one coming in March, episode 7, is Instrument Flight Rules. This should really go into quite some detail on how we can expect to navigate using the plane's various tools, instruments and displays. Meanwhile, in late March, we can expect to see a video on multiplayer. That one's going to be especially interesting. Now, there are a bunch of other informations available on this development roadmap, and the full image is available as a link in the video description. Now, the feedback snapshot is also worth a look. This contains a list of the top questions, the top alpha issues, and the top wish list. Now, unfortunately for us, detailed answers and further information on each of these bullet points is reserved for Microsoft or Flight Simulator insiders, which means it's not something that we can actually see here on this video. But nevertheless, it's nice to get a bit of insight as to what's going on in there. The top wishlist is particularly interesting. We got some third-party content, SDK, AI traffic, ATC, helicopters, seasons, shared cockpit functionality, and my favourite, VR and track IR. And finally, there's an update on the status of the software development kit. Now, this has gone out to the Flight Simulator partners, of which there are 30 in total at the moment, or at least 30 that have access to the SDK. The next alpha for the SDK can expect to have some improvements for existing tools, a new in-game aircraft editor that will allow configuration tuning for aircraft parameters, including the flight model. So very nice stuff. So there we have it then. That brings us to the end of this video. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you guys and girls next time.